In June of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the height of his power. He controlled France, dominated much of continental Europe, had defeated almost every major army sent against him, and commanded the largest invasion force Europe had ever seen. Austria had been defeated. Prussia had been humbled. Russia had already been beaten once. Napoleon had survived coalitions, revolutions, political conspiracies, and wars fought across half a continent. He had turned speed, organization, and personal confidence into an empire. Then he made the decision that would begin to destroy it. He invaded Russia. The popular version of the story is simple. Napoleon marched into Russia, winter arrived, and the cold defeated him. But that explanation is incomplete. Napoleon did not plan to spend the winter deep inside Russia. He crossed the frontier in summer. He expected a short campaign, a decisive battle, and a political settlement. His real mistake was not forgetting that Russia becomes cold. It was building an entire strategy around the belief that Russia would behave exactly as he needed it to behave. Napoleon expected the Russian armies to fight. He expected one major victory to break their will. He expected Tsar Alexander I to negotiate. He expected the enormous Grande Armée to survive by moving quickly through enemy territory. And when each of those expectations failed, Napoleon continued moving forward, because turning back would have meant admitting that the campaign itself had been based on a false idea. The greatest mistake Napoleon ever made was not one bad tactical order. It was the refusal to recognize that the war he had planned no longer existed. To understand why he invaded, we need to return to the strange alliance between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander. In 1807, Napoleon defeated the Russians at the Battle of Friedland. Soon afterward, he met Alexander on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River near Tilsit. The setting was carefully designed. Neither emperor would meet on the other's territory. Instead, they entered a floating pavilion as apparent equals. Napoleon was in a powerful position. Alexander's army had been defeated, and Prussia was at Napoleon's mercy. But Napoleon did not want to destroy Russia. He hoped to transform it from an enemy into a partner. The two emperors divided influence across Europe. Russia accepted Napoleon's dominance in much of the West. Napoleon appeared willing to tolerate Russian ambitions elsewhere. Most importantly, Alexander agreed to support Napoleon's economic war against Britain. This economic war was called the Continental System. Britain was Napoleon's most persistent enemy. After the destruction of the French and Spanish fleets at Trafalgar in 1805, a direct invasion of Britain became extremely difficult. Napoleon therefore tried to attack British power through trade. He ordered European ports to close to British goods. The theory was simple. Britain depended heavily on commerce. If the European continent refused to buy British products, the British economy would suffer, political pressure would grow, and the government might be forced to make peace. But the system had a structural weakness. An economic blockade only works when it is enforced. Europe had a long coastline, many ports, enormous demand for British goods, and countless opportunities for smuggling. Merchants avoided restrictions, officials accepted bribes. Neutral ships changed documents and flags. British trade found new routes and new markets. The blockade also hurt the countries enforcing it. European consumers lost access to goods they wanted. Merchants lost customers. Prices changed. Russian landowners, whose wealth depended partly on exporting raw materials such as timber, grain, and naval supplies, suffered from the restrictions on trade. From Napoleon's perspective, every violation weakened the entire system. From Alexander's perspective, the system demanded economic sacrifice for a French strategy that did not clearly benefit Russia. This is a classic problem in alliances. Two partners may agree on a policy while they share an enemy, but the costs of that policy are not always distributed equally. The stronger partner may interpret disobedience as betrayal. The weaker partner may interpret enforcement as domination. By 1810, Russia was moving away from the continental system and reopening parts of its trade. Alexander also imposed tariffs that harmed French luxury goods. Other tensions had accumulated. Napoleon had created the Duchy of Warsaw from Polish lands. To many Poles, Napoleon represented the possibility that an independent Polish state might return. To Russia, a revived Poland could threaten territories the Russian Empire had acquired during the partitions of Poland. Napoleon had also expanded French control across Europe, annexing territories and placing relatives or allies on thrones. Alexander increasingly feared that the balance created at Tilsit was disappearing. None of these disagreements made war inevitable, but they created a situation in which Napoleon believed his credibility was at risk. He had built an empire partly through the perception that resistance would eventually be punished. If Russia could ignore the continental system, other states might do the same. If Alexander could challenge Napoleon without consequences, Napoleon's political system could begin to weaken. This is where power creates a trap. The more a ruler depends on the image of invincibility, the more expensive compromise becomes. A normal government can revise a failed policy. An emperor who has built authority on constant victory may see revision as humiliation. Napoleon could have accepted that the continental system was not working. He could have negotiated a new relationship with Russia. He could have reduced his commitments in Spain, where French forces were already trapped in a brutal and expensive conflict. Instead, he decided that a demonstration of overwhelming force would restore obedience. The campaign was meant to be limited. Napoleon did not initially describe his objective as the conquest of the entire Russian Empire. He wanted to defeat the Russian armies near the frontier, force Alexander to negotiate, and return Russia to the continental system. This goal made sense only if Alexander agreed that one military defeat should end the war. Napoleon assumed that the political pattern of his earlier campaigns would repeat itself. In 1805, he defeated Austrian and Russian forces at Austerlitz. In 1806, he shattered the Prussian army at Jena and Auerstedt. In 1807, Friedland brought Alexander to the negotiating table. In 1809, another victory over Austria produced another settlement. The method seemed proven. Move rapidly. Separate enemy armies. Force a decisive battle. Win. Dictate peace. Napoleon's greatest strength became the source of his error. Past success created a mental model, and he began treating that model as a law of nature. Psychologists sometimes call this overgeneralization. A strategy works under several conditions, so we assume it will work under all conditions. But military success is never produced by one method alone. It depends on geography, weather, supply, politics, command structures, enemy choices, and the goals of both sides. Russia was not Austria. It had enormous strategic depth. Its government could lose territory without immediately losing the ability to fight. Its armies could retreat hundreds of kilometers while remaining inside their own country. And Alexander had decided that he would not negotiate simply because Napoleon occupied land or won a single battle. Napoleon prepared an enormous force. Estimates vary depending on which units and supporting troops are counted, but more than 500,000 men participated in the opening stages or crossed into the Russian Empire during the campaign. They came from across Europe. There were French soldiers, but also Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutchmen, Swiss, Croats, Spaniards, Portuguese, Austrians, Prussians, and others. The name Grande Armée suggests one unified instrument. In reality, it was a multinational coalition held together by Napoleon's empire. Different units spoke different languages. Their levels of training, motivation, and loyalty varied. Some soldiers admired Napoleon. Some hoped he would liberate Poland. Others served because their governments had been forced to provide troops. The size looked like strength. It was also a logistical warning. Every soldier needed food. Every horse needed fodder. Every gun needed ammunition. Every wagon required animals, drivers, repairs, and usable roads. An army of this size could consume an extraordinary amount each day. Napoleon created supply depots and organized enormous wagon trains, but his system still depended partly on speed and local resources. That approach had worked in densely populated regions of Central and Western Europe. Armies could move through productive territory, purchase or seize food, and reach major towns quickly. Russia presented different conditions. Distances were larger, roads were poorer, settlements were more widely separated. Maps could be inaccurate. The summer heat turned roads to dust, while rain could transform them into mud. And most importantly, the Russian forces could remove or destroy resources as they withdrew. The campaign began on June 24 when the army crossed the Niemen. Napoleon reportedly watched the columns move eastward. It must have appeared magnificent. Hundreds of thousands of men, horses, cannons, wagons, uniforms, flags, and equipment flowed into Russian territory. Europe had never seen an army like it. But the army began losing strength before it fought the decisive battle Napoleon wanted. This is one of the most misunderstood facts of the campaign. The Grande Armée was not destroyed only during the famous winter retreat from Moscow. Large numbers disappeared during the advance. Some deserted, some became sick, some fell behind. Horses died from exhaustion, inadequate food, disease, and the demands of the march. Supply vehicles broke down, food spoiled or failed to arrive. Water could be scarce or contaminated. Men marched through extreme heat, sudden rain, dust, mud, and crowded camps where illness spread easily. An army can look powerful on a map while becoming weaker every day in reality. This is the difference between nominal strength and effective strength. Nominal strength counts everyone listed on paper. Effective strength counts the soldiers who are healthy, present, supplied, organized, and capable of fighting. Napoleon's force was enormous in theory. The deeper it moved into Russia, the more difficult it became to convert that size into usable power. Meanwhile, the Russian armies retreated. They did not retreat because every commander had agreed from the beginning on one perfect strategy. Russian leadership was divided. Officers argued. Political pressure demanded action. Retreat damaged morale and allowed Napoleon to occupy territory. But retreat denied Napoleon the battle he needed. Each time he tried to trap a Russian army, it escaped farther east. This created a psychological problem. Napoleon had crossed the border to force a decision. The Russians refused to provide one. The farther they withdrew, the more Napoleon felt compelled to follow. If he stopped, he had occupied land but achieved no political result. Alexander had not surrendered. The continental system had not been restored. The Russian armies remained intact. Moving forward was dangerous. Stopping looked like failure. This is an escalation trap. A person makes an investment expecting a certain result. When the result does not appear, they invest more because abandoning the project would make the earlier cost feel wasted. Economists call the earlier investment a sunk cost. A sunk cost cannot be recovered. Rationally, it should not determine the next decision. The correct question is not, how much have we already spent? It is, what choice gives us the best future from this point? But human beings hate accepting losses. We continue bad projects, unhealthy relationships, failing businesses, and unwinnable conflicts because stopping forces us to admit that the original decision was wrong. Napoleon had spent money, mobilized Europe, damaged diplomacy, and crossed the frontier with the greatest army he had ever commanded. A limited withdrawal would have preserved much of that army. It would also have announced that the emperor could be resisted. So he continued. The city of Smolensk offered one opportunity for a major engagement. Fighting in August was fierce, and the Russians eventually abandoned the city. Napoleon had captured another important location. He had not destroyed the Russian army. At this point, serious questions should have ended the campaign. The army was already much smaller than it had been at the frontier. Supplies were stretched. The season was advancing. Napoleon was hundreds of kilometers from his starting position. He could have stopped around Smolensk, reorganized, strengthened supply lines, and prepared for a later campaign. But a winter position at Smolensk would still not force Alexander to negotiate. Napoleon wanted the political conclusion that only a great victory seemed able to provide. So the army moved toward Moscow. Moscow was not the official capital. St. Petersburg held that role. But Moscow had enormous historical and emotional importance. Napoleon believed that threatening or occupying it would create pressure on Alexander. Again, the plan depended on the enemy sharing Napoleon's idea of what had to be defended. If Alexander considered Moscow too important to lose, the Russians would fight. If Moscow fell, Alexander might negotiate. The Russians finally offered battle near the village of Borodino on September 7th. It became one of the bloodiest days of the Napoleonic Wars. The French attacked fortified Russian positions. Redoubts changed hands. Infantry advanced through artillery fire. Cavalry charged. Thousands of men were killed or wounded in hours. Napoleon won control of the battlefield, but it was not the kind of victory he needed. The Russian army was damaged but not destroyed. It withdrew in order. Napoleon had not captured Alexander, eliminated Russian military resistance, or produced a peace settlement. The French suffered terrible losses among experienced soldiers and officers who could not easily be replaced. Borodino demonstrates the difference between tactical victory and strategic victory. A tactical victory means success in the immediate battle. A strategic victory means the battle helps achieve the larger political goal. Napoleon occupied the ground. Alexander did not negotiate. The campaign continued. A few days later, Napoleon entered Moscow. He had reached one of the most famous cities in the Russian Empire, and there was almost no one there to surrender. Much of the population had left. The authorities were gone. The Russian army had withdrawn. Soon, fires spread through the city. The causes remained debated in detail, but the result was unmistakable. Large parts of Moscow burned, destroying buildings, shelter, and supplies. Napoleon had captured a prize that could not feed his army and did not end the war. This was the moment when the mistake became undeniable. The purpose of taking Moscow was to force peace. No peace came. Napoleon sent or encouraged attempts to communicate. Alexander refused to negotiate. The Emperor of France waited in a damaged city for the Emperor of Russia to react according to the script Napoleon had written for him. Alexander never accepted the role. Every day of waiting reduced the remaining margin for escape. The army consumed supplies. The weather grew colder. Russian forces recovered. Partisans and Cossacks threatened movement and communication. The road back became longer in psychological terms, because each day made the decision to leave feel more like an admission of defeat. Napoleon stayed in Moscow for roughly a month. That delay was one of the most damaging decisions of the campaign. But even here, the problem was larger than simple indecision. Napoleon had no satisfying option. If he left quickly, he would abandon the symbolic victory without a treaty. If he stayed, the military situation would worsen. If he moved towards St. Petersburg, he would go deeper into Russia with a weakened army. If he tried to remain in Moscow through winter, he needed shelter and supplies the burned city could not reliably provide. This is what happens when strategic assumptions collapse. Tactical skill cannot create a good option if every available choice leads away from the original goal. Napoleon eventually ordered the retreat in October. He first attempted to move southwest toward territory that had not been exhausted by the advance, but after fighting near Maloyaroslavets, he turned back toward the route through Smolensk. That choice forced the army to march through land it had already consumed and devastated. The retreat became a struggle against hunger, exhaustion, Russian attacks, collapsing discipline, and eventually severe cold. The famous winter now entered the story. But winter was not a single enemy that appeared suddenly and destroyed a healthy army. It magnified every earlier weakness. Hungry soldiers resist cold poorly. Exhausted horses die more easily. Men without proper shelter, clothing, or medical care become vulnerable to disease and exposure. Broken supply lines cannot deliver food when roads freeze or snow hides the route. A retreating army cannot easily protect stragglers. The cold turned a disaster into a catastrophe, but the disaster had already been created by distance, delay, attrition, and strategic failure. The loss of horses was especially devastating. Horses pulled artillery and supply wagons. Cavalry protected the army, gathered information, and screened movement. When horses died, guns had to be abandoned. Wagons could not move. Food and ammunition were left behind. Cavalrymen became infantry. The army lost mobility at exactly the moment mobility was necessary for survival. The failures began reinforcing one another. Dead horses meant abandoned wagons and artillery. Fewer wagons meant less food. Hunger weakened soldiers, and weakened soldiers fell behind or became sick. The army was no longer suffering from separate problems. It was trapped inside a chain reaction in which every loss made the next loss more likely. Russian forces did not need to defeat the entire Grande Armée in one perfect battle. They pressured it, blocked routes, attacked vulnerable units, and allowed distance and deprivation to continue their work. Cossack cavalry harassed the edges of the retreat. Peasants could attack isolated soldiers. Russian commanders sometimes missed opportunities or acted cautiously, but they no longer needed to give Napoleon the decisive battle he had wanted in summer. Time now favored Russia. The most dramatic moment came at the Berezina River in late November. The retreating army needed to cross while Russian forces approached from different directions. Bridges had been destroyed or were unavailable, and the French appeared close to complete entrapment. French engineers built temporary bridges in freezing water under terrible conditions. The army managed to cross, and Napoleon avoided total destruction. In military terms, the crossing was an extraordinary achievement, but it could not reverse the campaign. Thousands were lost around the river. Vehicles, civilians, wounded men, and stragglers created chaos. When the bridges were destroyed to prevent Russian pursuit, many remained on the wrong side. The Grande Armée that returned from Russia was only a fraction of the force that had entered. Exact numbers vary because historians count different categories: later reinforcements, prisoners, deserters, and troops detached from the main army in different ways. But the broad reality is beyond dispute. Hundreds of thousands were dead, wounded, captured, missing, or unable to return with the main force. The largest army Napoleon had assembled had been destroyed as an effective instrument. The human suffering was almost impossible to measure. Men froze beside roads. Wounded soldiers were abandoned. Hunger drove people to desperation. Diseases spread through exhausted columns. Civilians who followed the army suffered alongside soldiers. Communities across Russia had been burned, looted, or destroyed. The campaign was not only a strategic mistake, it was a human catastrophe created by the decisions of rulers who believed political credibility justified enormous risk. Napoleon left the army before the final remnants reached safety and hurried back to Paris. He needed to protect his government, organize new forces, and control the news. He tried to present the disaster as a result of extraordinary weather. The weather had indeed been severe. But blaming the weather offered a useful political story. Weather is no one's fault. A failed strategy is. The disaster transformed Europe. Before Russia, Napoleon appeared almost impossible to defeat permanently. After Russia, his enemies saw vulnerability. Napoleon built another army, proving that his organizational ability remained extraordinary. But new recruits could not immediately replace the experienced soldiers, officers, cavalrymen, and horses lost in 1812. An army is not merely a number. Veteran units contain trust, discipline, and habits created over years. Russia also destroyed something less visible: the expectation that resistance was useless. Prussia rose against Napoleon, Russia continued westward, Austria joined a new coalition, and Britain maintained pressure through the war in Spain. Napoleon still won battles, but the strategic balance had changed. By 1814, coalition forces entered Paris and Napoleon abdicated. He returned for the 100 Days, ending at Waterloo in 1815. Waterloo was his final battlefield defeat, but Russia was the mistake that made the final collapse possible. Some historians might choose the Peninsular War as his greatest error because it consumed French power for years. But the Russian campaign concentrated nearly all of Napoleon's weaknesses in one event: overconfidence, political rigidity, logistical overreach, dependence on a decisive battle, underestimation of the enemy, and refusal to stop after the original plan had failed. It was not simply a military defeat. It was a decision-making collapse. We can understand that collapse through several concepts. The first is overconfidence. Confidence is useful because action always involves uncertainty. A commander who doubts every decision cannot move quickly. Napoleon's confidence had helped him make bold choices while opponents hesitated. But confidence becomes dangerous when it prevents information from changing the plan. True confidence says, "I can adapt." Overconfidence says, "Reality must adapt to me." Napoleon did not merely believe he could defeat Russian forces, he believed Russian leaders would respond to defeat in the same way Austrian, Prussian, and Russian leaders had responded before. He confused his ability to win battles with the ability to control the political meaning of those battles. The second concept is planning fallacy. People systematically underestimate the time, cost, and difficulty of complex projects. We imagine the best sequence. The army moves quickly, supplies arrive, the enemy fights, Victory comes, negotiations begin. We pay less attention to the branches where roads fail, weather changes, disease spreads, the enemy retreats, or political leaders refuse compromise. The more stages a plan contains, the more opportunities exist for something to go wrong. The third concept is goal displacement. Napoleon's original goal was not Moscow. It was a political settlement. But as the Russians retreated, movement replaced purpose. Smolensk became the next objective. Then battle. Then Moscow. Capturing locations created visible progress, even when the locations did not produce the desired result. Organizations often make the same mistake. A company wants satisfied customers, but begins chasing the number of meetings held. A school wants learning, but focuses only on test scores. A person wants health, but becomes obsessed with a number on a device. The measurement or milestone replaces the real goal. Napoleon reached Moscow and was farther from success than when he crossed the border. The fourth concept is sunk cost escalation. Every kilometer made withdrawal emotionally harder. Every casualty increased the pressure to achieve something that would justify the casualties. Every week of preparation and every public promise made retreat appear more humiliating. But sacrifice does not make a failing plan more valuable. It only makes continuing more expensive. A good decision-maker must be willing to say, the information has changed. The original goal is no longer worth the additional cost. Napoleon was brilliant at exploiting an opponent's hesitation. In Russia, his own inability to accept strategic failure became the weakness his opponents exploited. The fifth concept is logistics. Logistics is often described as the boring side of war. It is the system that moves food, ammunition, medicine, clothing, animals, spare parts, information, and people to the right place at the right time. Tactics decide how troops fight. Logistics determines whether troops arrive capable of fighting. Napoleon's victories had created an image of war as movement, genius, and dramatic battle. But every rapid maneuver depended on roads, horses, supply depots, local food, healthy soldiers, and functioning administration. The Russian campaign stretched these systems beyond their limits. The lesson applies to any ambitious project. Vision does not replace capacity. A leader may announce a global expansion, a major construction project, or a revolutionary product. But success depends on ordinary details: staffing, transport, maintenance, inventory, training, communication, and time. Ignoring these details does not make a leader visionary. It makes the vision fragile. The final lesson is about identity. Napoleon had become the man who won. His authority, personal mythology, and political system were connected to that identity. When Russia refused to provide a victory, he faced more than a military problem. He faced a threat to who he believed himself to be. Changing course would require Napoleon the Conqueror to behave like Napoleon the cautious administrator. That may have been psychologically impossible. Success can create an identity prison. A founder becomes the person who always takes risks. An investor becomes the person who always predicts the market. A leader becomes the person who never retreats. Eventually, reality presents a situation where the old identity demands the wrong decision. The strongest response is flexibility. But flexibility can feel like self-betrayal. Napoleon's genius had been built on speed, concentration, and decisive action. Russia required patience, restraint, and acceptance of an incomplete result. He tried to solve the new problem with the identity that had solved the old ones. The tragedy is that Napoleon understood many of these principles. He knew the importance of supply. He knew armies lost strength over distance. He knew weather and roads could destroy plans. He knew politics mattered more than occupying ground. He was not an ignorant commander walking blindly into snow. He was an experienced leader who allowed pressure, pride, and past success to overpower his own knowledge. This makes the story more useful. The greatest mistakes are not always made by people who know nothing. They are often made by people whose expertise has worked so well that they stop noticing where it no longer applies. Napoleon did not fail because he lacked intelligence. He failed because intelligence cannot help when a person refuses to update the conclusion. He crossed the Niemen expecting a short war. He reached Smolensk without the decisive victory he needed. He fought at Borodino without destroying the Russian army. He occupied Moscow without obtaining peace. He waited for a message that never came. He retreated after the season. Supplies, horses, and army had already been lost. At every stage, the facts became clearer. At every stage, accepting them became more painful. That was the real winter Napoleon could not escape. Not only the cold outside, the freezing of his strategy, the inability to turn, the belief that one more march, one more city, one more week, or one more display of determination would force reality back into the original plan. It never did. The Russian campaign teaches a simple but uncomfortable principle. When the reason for a plan disappears, the plan must change. Effort is not evidence that the goal remains possible. Sacrifice is not proof that more sacrifice will be rewarded. Past victories do not control future conditions, and moving forward is not always progress. Sometimes the greatest act of leadership is not advancing. It is recognizing the moment when the map in your mind no longer matches the ground beneath your feet. Napoleon failed to recognize that moment. He kept marching until the largest army in Europe became a trail of exhausted survivors moving west through the snow. He entered Russia to prove that his empire could not be challenged. He left having proved that it could be defeated. That was the biggest mistake Napoleon ever made.